The journey from the wooden hulls of Columbus's fleet to the granite foundations of the American presidency is a saga of transformation, where 3 centuries of wilderness, blood, and philosophy forged a new type of nation. When Christopher Columbus made landfall on October 12, 1492, he was searching for a passage to the east, but he instead opened a gateway for the European Old World to consume the New. This term, New World, was a European invention. For the millions of indigenous people already living there, the land was ancient and deeply rooted. To the explorers, however, it represented a literal new reality, vast, unmapped lands with different flora, fauna, and untapped wealth that didn't fit into their existing maps of the world. For the first century, Spain held a virtual monopoly, extracting unimaginable wealth from the south. England, however, remained a peripheral player until the late 16th century. Their first attempt at settlement, the Roanoke colony in 1585, ended in a chilling mystery, vanishing completely. It wasn't until May 14, 1607, when 3 ships, the Susan Constant, Goodspeed, and Discovery, sailed up the James River that the English foothold became permanent. This was Jamestown, a settlement driven by the Virginia Company's hunger for gold, though it eventually found its brown gold in tobacco. The 1600s saw the Atlantic coast carved into distinct cultural pockets. In 1620, the Pilgrims, religious separatists, arrived at Plymouth on the Mayflower. The Mayflower was a merchant ship, likely built for carrying cargo like wine and cloth, which spent 66 grueling days crossing the Atlantic with 102 passengers squeezed into its cramped, dark tween deck. Blown off course by fierce storms, the ship landed far north of its intended destination in Virginia. Because they were landing in territory where their patent was not valid, the passengers faced potential lawlessness. Before stepping ashore, they drafted the Mayflower Compact, a revolutionary document because it based government on the consent of the governed rather than a king's decree. The Mayflower Compact was a short 200-word agreement signed by 41 of the ship's adult male passengers on November 11, 1620. Faced with a mutinous atmosphere because they had landed outside the jurisdiction of their legal charter, the settlers realized they needed a way to maintain order. They agreed to combine themselves into a civil body politic and promised to enact just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. While they still pledged loyalty to King James I, the compact was a milestone in political history. It was the first document in the New World to establish self-government by a written social contract, proving that a group of people could successfully govern themselves without a nearby monarch. Throughout the mid-17th century, the colonies expanded. Massachusetts Bay, 1630, became a Puritan stronghold. Maryland, 1632, served as a Catholic refuge, and Pennsylvania, 1681, founded by Penn William, introduced the radical Quaker idea that all people were equal. During this time, the colonies thrived under a policy known as salutary neglect. Coined by statesman Edmund Burke, this was an intentional lack of enforcement by the British government regarding trade laws like the Navigation Acts. Because Britain was 3,000 miles away and preoccupied with European wars and its own glorious revolution, it calculated that leaving the colonies alone would actually increase their wealth and, by extension, Britain's. Salutary neglect is formally defined as the unofficial British policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of the American colonies. By not strictly enforcing parliamentary laws, particularly those regarding taxes and trade, Britain allowed the colonies to flourish economically. However, this beneficial ignoring had a massive unintended consequence. It gave the colonists the space to develop their own independent political institutions and a sense of self-reliance. As long as raw materials like timber, tobacco, and fur kept flowing to London, and the colonies remained a market for British manufactured goods, the crown looked the other way while colonial merchants smuggled molasses from the French West Indies. This period of healthy ignoring lasted for nearly 70 years, fostering an environment where the American colonies became effectively self-governing. This neglect was salutary, beneficial, because it allowed the Americans to develop their own political identity. They established local legislatures, such as the Virginia House of Burgesses, where they raised their own taxes and passed their own laws. By the time Britain tried to reassert control in the 1760s, the colonists had spent over 100 years practicing self-rule. They felt like Englishmen, but they lived like freemen, and they viewed any attempt to tax them from London not as a new policy, but as a violation of their established way of life. The era of peace ended when the British and French empires collided over the Ohio River Valley. This conflict is categorically known as the 7 Years' War, a truly global struggle that Winston Churchill once called the First World War. While it officially began in Europe in 1756, the spark was struck in the American wilderness in 1754, where the theater was locally known as the French and Indian War. It pitted the British Empire and its colonies against the French Empire and their indigenous allies, eventually involving every major European power and spanning from India to the Caribbean. The 7 Years' War was a fight for global dominance. In North America, a young colonial officer named George Washington gained his first taste of command during its early skirmishes. By the time the Treaty of Paris, 1763, ended the conflict, Britain emerged as the world's leading colonial power, driving the French out of mainland North America. However, while Britain won the war by 1763, the victory was a poisoned chalice. This term, poisoned chalice, refers to a prize that seems beneficial, but actually contains the seeds of one's own destruction. While Britain gained massive territories in North America, the triumph came with a lethal debt and a newfound administrative burden. To secure this new empire, Britain kept a standing army in the colonies, which cost roughly £300,000 a year, an expense they couldn't afford. The victory was a poisoned chalice because the very steps taken to pay for it, taxing the colonies, ended up destroying the empire Britain had just fought so hard to expand. The British national debt doubled, and the London government decided the era of salutary neglect must end. The colonies should finally pay their share for the 10,000 British troops stationed in America. King George III, who took the throne in 1760, was a man of rigid duty. He viewed the colonies as subordinates, not partners. His proclamation of 1763 further incensed the Americans by prohibiting them from settling the lands they had just fought to win from the French. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was issued by King George III on October 7, 1763, following Great Britain's acquisition of French territory in North America. Its primary purpose was to stabilize the western frontier by creating a proclamation line along the Appalachian Mountains. Settlers were strictly forbidden from crossing this line to buy land or settle, a move intended to prevent further costly conflicts with Native American tribes, such as the recent Pontiac's Rebellion. To the colonists, however, this felt like a betrayal. Many had fought and died in the war specifically to expand into the fertile Ohio Valley. They viewed the proclamation not as a peacekeeping measure, but as an attempt by the British ruler to keep them confined to the coast, where they could be more easily taxed and controlled. The struggle intensified with a series of legislative shocks. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the first time Parliament taxed the colonies directly on internal trade. Colonists responded with the Stamp Act Congress, asserting that they could not be taxed by a body where they had no representatives. The Stamp Act, passed on March 22, 1765, required that many printed materials in the colonies, ranging from legal documents and newspapers to playing cards, be produced on stamped paper produced in London, carrying an embossed revenue stamp. Unlike previous trade taxes, this was an internal tax that affected nearly everyone, particularly the most vocal members of society, lawyers and journalists. It sparked the first major organized resistance, leading to the creation of the Sons of Liberty. Tensions turned lethal on March 5, 1770, during the Boston Massacre, when a street brawl escalated into British soldiers firing into a crowd. Though a period of relative calm followed, the Tea Act of 1773 reignited the fire. The Tea Act, passed on May 10, 1773, was not actually designed to raise revenue, but to bail out the struggling British East India Company. It allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price than smuggled Dutch tea, effectively giving them a monopoly. Colonists saw this as a Trojan horse. If they accepted the cheap tea, they were essentially conceding that Parliament had the right to tax them. The Boston Tea Party, December 16, 1773, was a calculated act of property destruction. On a cold Thursday night, a group of roughly 60 colonists, some poorly disguised as Mohawk Indians to hide their identities, boarded 3 ships. Over the course of 3 hours, they smashed open 342 chests of tea with axes and dumped nearly 92,000 pounds of tea into the Boston harbor. The act was incredibly precise. No property other than the tea was damaged, and the decks were even swept clean afterward. This act of defiance pushed King George III over the edge. In 1774, the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, a series of 4 punitive laws designed specifically to punish the colony of Massachusetts. These included the Boston Port Act, closing the harbor until the tea was paid for, effectively strangling the city's economy. The Massachusetts Government Act, handing control of the colony's government over to the king's appointed officials and banning town meetings. The Administration of Justice Act, allowing British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England rather than the colonies. And the Quartering Act, demanding that colonists provide housing and food for British troops. Colonists rebranded these the Intolerable Acts. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the laws horrified the other 12 colonies, leading them to form the First Continental Congress to organize a unified response. The first blood was shed at dawn on April 19, 1775, at Lexington and Concord. Local Minutemen faced off against British redcoats searching for hidden gunpowder. By the summer, the Second Continental Congress had appointed George Washington as the commander of a new Continental Army. George Washington was a Virginia planter and a seasoned military officer who fought alongside the British during the French and Indian War. He was not a flashy orator, but he possessed an undeniable physical presence and a reputation for iron-willed integrity. Standing over 6 feet tall, rare for that era, he was chosen to lead the revolution not just for his military experience, but because he was a figure of unity who could bridge the gap between the northern and southern colonies. On July 4, 1776, the colonies officially severed ties. The Declaration of Independence was more than a breakup letter. It was a philosophical manifesto stating that governments exist to serve the people, and when they fail, the people have a right to abolish them. The war that followed was a grueling test of will. The Americans suffered through the freezing winter of Valley Forge, 1777 to 78, but gained hope after the Battle of Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga, fought in September and October 1777, is widely considered the turning point of the American Revolution. British General John Burgoyne had devised a plan to cut the colonies in 2 by marching south from Canada to Albany, New York. However, his progress was slowed by difficult terrain and constant harassment from American sharpshooters. In two distinct clashes at Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, American forces led by Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold eventually surrounded Burgoyne's army. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered nearly 6,000 British troops. This victory was a diplomatic game changer. It provided the visual proof needed to convince King Louis XVI of France that the Americans could actually win, leading to the formal Franco-American alliance in 1778. George Washington realized he could not win by force alone. He had to outmaneuver the British. In 1781, he executed his masterstroke, the trap at Yorktown. General Lord Cornwallis had moved his British army to Yorktown, Virginia, to await supplies from the sea. Washington, seeing a rare opportunity, abandoned his planned attack on New York and led a combined American and French force on a secret 400-mile march south. To keep the British in New York confused, he built fake camps and sent deceptive messages for them to intercept. Meanwhile, the French Navy, led by Admiral de Grasse, defeated the British fleet at the Battle of the Capes, cutting off Cornwallis's only escape route by water. With the French fleet sealing the sea and Washington's army surrounding him on land, Cornwallis was caught in a lethal pincher. After 3 weeks of bombardment, the end came on October 19, 1781, at Yorktown, where Washington trapped the British army against the sea. Independence was won, but the United States were barely united. From 1781 to 1789, the country was governed by the Articles of Confederation, which were intentionally weak because the people feared another ruler like George III. The central government couldn't tax, print a single currency, or raise an army. By 1786, with the economy in shambles and Shays' Rebellion threatening civil war, it was clear the system had failed. In May 1787, 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. They scrapped the old system and designed a new one, a federal republic with 3 branches of government to ensure no one person could become a tyrant. This was a new nation in every sense. It was an experiment in democracy that had no modern parallel. Once the U.S. Constitution was ratified, the nation held its first election. On April 30, 1789, George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City. He took the oath of office, becoming the first president of the United States. Unlike the kings of Europe, he wore a plain brown suit rather than a crown, symbolizing that the new ruler was not a master, but a servant of the law and the people.